Dr. Baljeet Malhotra, I'll turn it over to you to walk us through it.
Thank you so much, Ted. It's really an honor for us to be with this community again. I believe with Houston chapter, this is our first workshop. So thank you, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon in Texas, I believe. I'm based here in Vancouver. So it's a 10 a.m. or 10:15 a.m. Rainy day, but little sunshine I can see now. My name is Baljeet Malhotra. I'm founder and CEO of Teejlab. And before I get started, I would like to give a quick background about what we do, about my personal background, and why we are interested in this topic and this community service. So before starting Teejlab, I was VP of research at Black Duck Software, which is a very well-known brand for open source risk management. I started their R&D division back in 2016, and eventually Black Duck got acquired by Synopsys, another software security company. They do a lot of other things as well, but their software division bought Black Duck. And since then, I have been dedicated to Teejlab. Before Black Duck, I was with SAP as a research director, looking into, again, open source risk management and other related topics. We were responsible for usage of open source across SAP products and services. Before that, I had a stint with academia, did my PhD with specialization in data management. And I'll be honest, I'm not a security or risk management expert. My specialization is data management, applying data science to solve big data problems. And I found this opportunity that security and risk management is not only a risk problem, it is also a data management problem, because many of these problems are addressed by providing analytics that can be mined by various forms of structured and unstructured data. And security, compliance issues, licensing issues, a lot of times you're dealing with structured and unstructured data. So I've spent 15 years or so of my career, looking into these problems, how we can mitigate, risk or security problems that plague the IT industry. In the last 5 years or so, my focus has been more on API management. And that's where at Teejlab, we are helping organizations with API risk management. This is the overall agenda of the workshop. In the first 20 minutes, as Ted mentioned, I will be spending some time about explaining why this topic is so important. And if you haven't looked into this topic, this is a good time. You, either as a security professional or risk management professional, either you are a manager or individual contributing to different compliance aspects in your organization, this is an evolving topic. And as Ted said very rightly, a lot of companies are moving into the cloud. Their software is moving into the cloud, more so data is also moving into the cloud. So the challenges, the traditional challenges of risk are evolving as well because of this movement. So I will talk about how these API ecosystems are evolving, and because of this evolution, how the various risks are evolving within an enterprise. And then I will go a little bit deeper on the security and legal aspect of that. I'll talk about how do we classify different risks, either these are financial risks or business risks, and and some of the other risks. Somewhere in between, we'll also take a break, and then I will go a bit more hands-on and use some of the models that we can use to manage those risks. I mean, it wouldn't be very interesting if I just talk about problems and I talk about the solution. So in the later part, I will talk about how these solutions or models can be adopted to manage your risks. And one of the interesting models that we have started to investigate very recently, and we have gone back to the communities to talk about that, is zero trust model. And this is a model once again, getting very attention from the industry, and this model is not necessarily only for API risk management. As you know, some of you may have already looked into this. Zero trust model is an overarching model which talks about cybersecurity across your enterprise. But we'll take that model and try to apply onto managing risks from API ecosystems. And as I mentioned, we will see some hands-on exercises. I will invite you to use certain tools, and we will go through some examples which will hopefully will enrich your experience. I really want this to be a two-way dialogue. I just do not want to pretend to be an expert knowing everything. So I definitely encourage participation from everybody. So feel free to type in your questions in the chat window. Apart from Ted, my colleague Nicole is there. She's monitoring the chat. And if you feel that certain clarifications are needed before we proceed, feel free to type in those questions, and I'll be happy to give a pause and answer those questions. I will also try to keep some Q&A at the end as well, in case if we have more questions. So let me start with the basic terminology around API ecosystems. Now, I do not necessarily need to tell you what an API is. I'm inherently assuming you already know how APIs are connecting different digital systems. Either it is your enterprise system or your social media or even your logistic operations or your banking. Everything is connected through these APIs. More importantly, you may have your own internal APIs, you may have your third-party APIs. So the ecosystem of this API is really, really complex, and it is evolving as we speak. So how does a enterprise API ecosystem look like? So let's take a look at that. So if we look at the global scale, this ecosystem is evolving much faster than you can imagine. And in a lot of times, I've compared this ecosystem with something we have seen with the growth of websites. Early 2000, we saw how web exploded. Now we are seeing APIs are being built by organizations to provide their different digital services. They're not very much different from a website in the with the difference that they are a bit more dynamic. They provide certain information, and oftentimes they're built for machine-to-machine communication. With IoT taking off in a big way, AI, ML solutions, software moving into the cloud and becoming services, all of these different dimensions have given fuel to the growth of APIs. And according to one estimation by Akamai, which is a respected organization in this space, they estimate that 83% of the internet traffic is through APIs now. We did our own research, and we estimate that there are roughly 1 million APIs that are publicly available already that you can use in your different products and services. We actually took a sample of the internet, roughly estimating 1.2 billion different websites we investigated, and we could see, how many vendors are there that are providing different kinds of API integrations. And as I mentioned, this is our own research, which estimates that this number is, around 1 million, but we could very much be off the actual real number, which could be perhaps in the order of tens of millions. And believe me, this number is not going to stay constant. This is going to evolve. As I mentioned, every IoT device, every logistic company, pretty much every company on the planet will need these connectors, which these APIs are, to provide various digital services. So this number will go into millions, and who knows, perhaps into billions in the near future. So so this was a global view how the API ecosystem is evolving. Now let me show you how an enterprise API ecosystem may look like. Now, this is a overview of a enterprise. Now, certain aspects may not necessarily be applicable to your organization or may be relevant to the context you work with. But in general, many of these aspects you might be able to relate with. So let me explain this in bit more detail. If you look at the bottom of this diagram, you will see software analysis tools, network analysis tool. You might have security tools in place. You might have certain aspects of reporting and analytics. This is all part of your DevSecOps environment. There are various tools that interact with your API ecosystem. Many times these organizations, they do not necessarily want your dashboards or the solutions provided by certain vendors. All they want is API integrations through which they can pump in the data into their own dashboards and do this. On top of that, you may have API gateways that are part of your ecosystem, which is typically needed when you're managing your own APIs, because you want to manage who's accessing your APIs. You want to have certain policies and whatnot. You may have certain service mesh technologies in place, which is really needed for you when you're consuming APIs, or it could be a combination of both. On top of that, you may have marketplaces. For example, you may publish certain APIs to your third-party ecosystems, your vendors. You may have paid APIs. And then if you just climb up this ladder, and if you go on the top of this diagram, you will see you have communities. These communities may consist of your own developers. This may include your partners. This may include your customers who need to consume your APIs, or this may actually include vendors from which you're consuming APIs. So this entire ecosystem of APIs could be very, very complex. And in this kind of scenario, it is not really easy for you to start imagining, how API governance operates or works. Now, there is no fixed definition to API management or API governance. Every organization have their own views, they have their own philosophies, they have their own toolings, they have their own processes in place to enable this management. But the point I'm trying to make here is it could be as complex as having all of these components or a section of these components and whatnot. As I've already mentioned, at the global scale, 83% of the traffic is through internet. In theory, you can imagine in your organization, it could also be that much. Some organization may be less, some organization may be more. But again, the point here is, on average, every organization may have that amount of internet traffic, or their digital services are contributing to this much traffic through APIs. So why this ecosystem is so complex? Let me go into a bit more detail here. But before I do that, I am seeing in the chat there are some questions. So let me turn it back to Ted. Ted, do you see any questions that need answers at this stage? Okay, I quickly browsed through the Q&A. Doesn't look like there are any questions. Ted, if you were speaking, you were on mute. So feel free to unmute yourself if you have any comments. Okay, there is one question which says, agree with risk. However, would you elaborate on how prevalent is the non-disclosure of APIs by vendors? I'm referring to partnerships that a cloud vendor does not disclose of third-party systems for which they need integration to offer its solution and services. Some vendors disclose that to their clients, need to whitelist specific websites or for our users to access the full functionality of the system. Sometimes they don't. So this is a relevant question. Now, one answer that I can provide, or insight I can provide here is, a lot of times you may actually not necessarily know what APIs your system is connected with, simply because of this problem that the vendors are not disclosing their API integrations. Um, uh, uh, According to the recent presidential order, if you have read it, or if you got a chance to browse through it, there is one term which is very often referred as software bill of material. It used to be the case for open source libraries that the vendors were supposed to tell, but now with more and more cloud services being offered, your software bill of material is not complete without disclosing the different API integrations. Because at the end of the day, APIs are nothing but providing data interfaces. They are transacting some sort of data or decision. So the answer to your question is absolutely, that disclosure is needed. If they don't provide that disclosure, you must work with them or with your internal teams to disclose those APIs. And oftentimes that is the challenge, where organizations do not necessarily know all their APIs. Forget about third-party APIs. Sometimes, not sometimes, oftentimes we have interacted with tens of different organizations. Sometimes these organizations do not even know their internal APIs. They have a business unit one, they have a business unit two, and so on and so forth. So if APIs are internal but built for one organization, but then the rest of the organization do not even know the other internal APIs. So absolutely, this question is very relevant. And as we progress in this workshop, I will try to address, why discovery is a very, very important piece of API governance. Hopefully that answered your question, but I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions if there is any. Okay, so please allow me to continue. Now, I was telling the audience that based on this picture that I showed here, what are the different ingredients or the units from API ecosystem itself? Now, that ecosystem consists of people, different teams, organizations, processes, and tools. Now, let me get into the actual API API nuts and bolts. So this ecosystem may consist of external APIs. Now you need to have some sort of a way to centralize your inventory. What are different APIs? Who are the different vendors who are providing these APIs? Where exactly these APIs are integrated? How often we use these APIs? Of course, if these are your partner APIs, perhaps you're not worried about cost, because these are not something you are paying for. But it could be the case where you may have APIs for which you are receiving certain services, and you're paying. And by the way, who owns these APIs? It is very much possible that there is one API that needs to be used by two different products owned by two different teams. So do you have two different accounts to access those APIs, or there is a central account that allows you to use these APIs into different products? Who manages those accounts? Who manages the relationship? Who manages the rate limits? So all those issues become very important as part of your API governance process. Once again, access control, of course, the vendors would provide all the nuts and bolts to make sure that their APIs are access control. But once you have the access, who's using them internally? Especially this become important when it comes to paid APIs. Then on top of that, you have to manage the licenses. You may have a pricing issues, and you have to constantly check for the security posture or legal posture of those APIs. Because although this is an API that you did not build, but your product depends on it. So if this API is compromised, what is the impact on your business continuity, simply because it's impacting your product? So that is one bucket. Then the other bucket is you have your own internal APIs. Now, the definition itself of internal APIs could be very confusing. Why? Because although I said it is an internal API, but it is an internal API that needs to be accessed by your external partner. It is not publicly available APIs. Of course, you have put all access controls around them. But this needs to be consumed by a handful of your customers or partners or whatnot. So the real definition of internal is not internal, but something you define. What does it mean to have an internal API? Is this controlled by one particular business unit for their own internal teams, or this is uh, for one business unit by another business unit, or by one business unit for their customers and partners? And once again, you need to control your inventory, you need to have the ownership, you need to control your versions, you need to have access control mechanism in place. And once again, some of these APIs you might be providing to your partners at a cost. So how do you manage those? How do you manage those subscriptions and whatnot? So once again, these are some of the issues that becomes part of your API governance process. Among these two buckets, really interesting bucket is when you don't even know your APIs. Now, how is even that possible that you do not know your APIs? I tried to hint in the beginning itself, but let me go into this bucket with little more detail, and let's look into this with some thoughtful process. Now, you may have an organization which has a lot of developers, maybe in hundreds or thousands. You may have partners, you may hire consultants, you may hire third parties to develop solutions, or you may buy companies, you may acquire companies. Because of all those different reasons, certain APIs might make into your ecosystem simply because of these reasons. For example, a developer downloaded a GitHub library for a certain functionalities. Now, this developer may not necessarily know there are these APIs are also part of that, that are part of that library. Similarly, you bought a company or your organization merged with another organization, or you acquired the assets from another organization. And oftentimes these digital assets integrations, you already have certain API integrations. I've seen cases firsthand where a single product could bring 5,000 plus different integrations through an M&A acquisition. Now, not necessarily this is the case always, but as the software becomes connected with different ecosystems, more and more API integrations happen, and because of those reasons, you may see the number of APIs increasing in all these solutions. And in many cases, these solutions, when you acquired them, or when these were being built, you may not necessarily have a repo or a API marketplace or a gateway where you have already accounted for these APIs. Maybe they are already bypassing your API gateways. So because of this unknown problem, unknown APIs that you did not even know, imagine the risk that poses to the organization. Now, in a simple word, you cannot manage what you don't know. Right, so this third bucket is really, really important, and I will try to address it in a bit more detail as we move along to see, how do we solve this problem using some tools and processes. Now, this is a real snapshot of an API ecosystem that we are tracking, and here you can see that. By the way, each dot represents a API vendor. So either API or a vendor where these APIs are being consumed or being produced. Now, you can see that geographically, all these APIs are spread across different geographies. Now, unlike a software which you are shipping or which you are putting into the cloud that your customers and partners are using it. In this case, if you're using third-party APIs, you have a massive ecosystem from whom you're consuming different services. Now think from a data sovereignty perspective. Each of these APIs are hosted into different geographies using different technologies, and you really need to know who these vendors are, where exactly they are located, if these APIs are transacting any personal information, where exactly that data is being stored. Because you may have a vendor who's based in the US, but that that vendor may be hosting its services in AWS or in GCP or in Azure in India or in China or somewhere else where they can cut some of their costs. So all these are relevant questions, and this really becomes an important part of data governance as well. Before I move further, I'm just taking a quick look at the Q&A. And there is a question by Jeff. APIs are fairly seamless, interfacing from one system to another. From an audit perspective, how are APIs verified for completeness and accuracy, and how are others auditing them? So that you summed up the essence of this workshop. That is exactly what we are trying to address here. Because of this seamless integration. The whole idea around API is the seamless integration, accelerating the product development. You do not necessarily want to reinvent the wheel, and also you may not have certain expertise that these other companies can provide through their API integrations, right? So all those reasons are there for you to use APIs. But again, that seamlessness brought this risk as well in terms of third-party services, in terms of what these APIs do, what data they transact, are these APIs secure, what about their authentication authorization, do they meet our standards? All those issues become part of the problem, and somehow somebody needs to audit them. Uh, if you as an organization are part of GRC or some other teams, then probably that is the right place to start with. Some of the organizations, they are starting their own API offices, just like open source office. There could be API management offices now. And those are the teams, working with developers, legal teams. It's a coordinated effort to do this kind of auditing, because you need to see the context in which these APIs are being used. Are these free APIs? If these are free, what are the limits? How do you ensure that these limits are not being crossed? So these are all different issues that needs to be part of audit, not just audit, one-time audit, but also ongoing management, ongoing governance processes that you need in place. So Jeff, that was a great question. Thank you for the question. I hope I answered that, but please feel free to type in again if there is any follow-up question. Okay, so there is another question. Actually, there are more than one. Some people are typing into the chat, some people are typing into Q&A. If I can request everybody to type in their questions in Q&A, that will be easier for me to track. Otherwise, I have to switch back between chat and Q&A. So whatever questions are there, that's fine. But if you can please, next questions, if you can put it into the Q&A, that'll be great. So I'm reading the chat now. So there is one question that I can read. To what level do you need to inventory APIs? Most organizations, from a risk standpoint, identify solutions which interface with them. APIs are typically an afterthought. For example, internal system interfaces with 3 internal systems and 2 external parties. The APIs are not necessarily disclosed. So you are very right, whoever asked that question, and that is part of the problem. And I can tell you for sure that this non-disclosure approach will not scale moving forward, because for sure government contracts, organizations are enforcing through this legislation that they need to disclose all these software dependencies. And APIs are nothing but dependencies. Although the software element is less, it's a low code, no code scenario. But again, knowing who's the vendor to which this API is integrated, and more importantly, what data it is transacting, how secure it is, from your own product's security posture. But from a data governance perspective, you really need to know what is the functionality this API is providing. And as I said, APIs are nothing but transacting data. So where is that data being stored? When you're invoking your API, if there is an input, where is that input gonna store if this is not your API? So absolutely very important questions. And again, there is no one single answer. Every organization has their own way to address these questions. They have their own tools, but I can tell you that this space is evolving. There is no one perfect tool that can manage all that. So you need to have a combination of different things to manage your risk. There was another question. Are there standard benchmark for APIs and they tested to ensure they meet recommended security standards? Yes. So there are certain community-driven standards, OWASP being one of them. So OWASP, as you guys know, they came with the top 10 application security scenarios. Since 2019, they also came up with the API-specific top 10 scenarios as well. And you can use that standard to benchmark your APIs. Depending on which industry you belong to, you may have some additional requirements. You may have FAPI, you may have CIS, you may have PII. There are certain other standards you need to be compliant with to make sure that you have a robust posture when it comes to API usage. There are a few more questions. So very interesting question, everybody. Thank you so much. I think this is making this presentation more interesting. So some of the questions are, what can be done to inventory API and manage the transactions? So that's one question. The other question is, can malware be embedded in APIs? Absolutely. What tool can be used to track API in action? So these are very interesting technical questions. And thanks, Andy. Andy asked these questions. So when it comes to managing your APIs, the very first step is to have a handle on your inventory. Because as I said many times, if you do not even know your APIs, then how can you manage your risk, right? Either your internal APIs or your external APIs, doesn't really matter. You need to know your APIs. So if you do not know APIs, then you must find those APIs. We as a company, we have invested heavily into this space in the discovery process. So I want this to be a vendor neutral talk, so I don't want to promote ourselves, but again, there are solutions that you can use to discover your APIs, okay? And once you do discover, you need tools to benchmark those APIs. As I mentioned, you can use certain community-driven standards. Once you do that, you also need to have ongoing management as well. A lot of organizations, they have started to have what they call record of systems. So you can choose to record each input that is being given to API and also each response as well. But again, depending on the situation, are you an API provider or are you API consumer? Certainly, if you're a consumer, you can record the outputs of those APIs because that's your data. But if you are providing API as a producer, then do you really, because you are providing that as a service, I'm not sure whether what kind of contract you have. So are you allowed to, because depending on your customers' inputs, APIs could produce different outputs. So are you allowed to record those outputs? You may have different reasons to record it. For example, you can say you are trying to analyze user behavior, or your API is being abused. Is somebody trying to inject malicious code into your APIs? So you have various reasons, and you can use those clauses to manage your API risk when it comes to tracking those APIs in action. Another question was, can malware be injected through APIs? Yes, it is technically possible, because sometimes there are APIs that have file inputs. there are APIs that produce file outputs as well. So you can imagine somebody can put an API out there with these kind of functionalities, and of course it is possible for them to inject a malicious code, or you can download certain files through these APIs which will be malicious. So yes, absolutely that is possible. All right, so a quick pause again to see if anybody has any follow-up question. Great questions again. Thank you for all the questions. There are no more questions, so I will continue. Okay, so coming back to my slides again. So this was a real example of a global API ecosystem that an enterprise may have. This is not a demo capture. This is actually a live capture of a system where each dot is representing the vendor, the API, and what data is being transacted and all of that. And you have the capability to drill down to see those for your data governance perspective. Now let me get so far I started with how API ecosystem may look like at a global scale, how API ecosystem may look like within an enterprise, and how these API ecosystems may evolve. And I gave you a real example of a snapshot of an API ecosystem of an enterprise. Now let me go into what are the different risks we are talking about here from the API ecosystem perspective. So this is an example where we are seeing a real API output that I'm showing you, where we see API leaking, credit card information, personal information, sometimes even passwords and things like that. And this is basically one example of many examples that are happening right now. And many times these APIs are compromised because of authorization and authentication problems. And as I mentioned in one of the answers when I gave, OWASP is one of the standards you can use to benchmark your APIs. And here I'm showing you for this particular API, when we benchmark this against different OWASP top 10 requirements, either it's a broken authentication problem or authorization problem or injection problem, we found that many times APIs are actually affected by authentication and authorization problems. So authorization, there are various authorization mechanisms you can use. You may have basic auth, you may have API key based, you have OAuth, or different flavors of authorization or authentication issues may be there. Where you may have a good authentication in place, but your query may be broken, or your policies may be broken when it comes to authorizing the right access to individuals who need to access your resources through those APIs. So between these two, authorization and authentication problems, they cover majority of the API related problems. That's how important authorization and authentication problems are. And this is verified. This is again, we did one research, and you can see from these numbers, we tracked NVD data to look into API specific problems. So as you know, if you don't know NVD, it's a national vulnerability database which is managed by NIST. All kinds of vulnerabilities are reported, not just API related. But in the last 10 years or so, we took only those vulnerabilities that are somehow related to API problems or API related problems. And you can see from this frequency, this is the average across those different problems that are specific to APIs. And you can see the top ones were authorization and authentication problems. And this tells us that authentication, authorization is are very important areas for when it comes to securing your API ecosystem. Now let me go into a bit more detail. What are some of the authentication problems? Now, you may have very simple issues like you do not have any authentication at all. Why that would happen? You may say, oh, this is my internal API. I don't need any authentication because nobody's going to access outside my organization. But suddenly you released a software which got into GitHub because simply you made it open source, and by mistake these APIs were part of that application, and suddenly you expose your internal APIs. There could be other reasons where your authentication framework is broken and some of these APIs are publicly available or accessible. On top of that, you may use certain policies or procedures, including you may have policies that are not necessarily robust enough. For example, you may have API keys that are easily guessable, which means that you have a serial number which anybody can guess. Okay, this is the API key. And also you may have API keys that are always fixed. You are not rotating them. And as you know, once your API keys are stolen, pretty much a person who has your API key has access to those APIs. And if you do not force your users to rotate their API keys, they always have access to those APIs. You may have certain other cases where you are asking the users to pass their credentials in URL, and sometimes browsers cache those URLs, and hence you're exposing your password in cached browsers, which through other techniques can be compromised. You may have certain basic auth or token-based approaches which are not robust enough. And in some cases, you may have weak authentication, which allows you to basically guess user IDs and passwords if you're using basic auth. And also sometimes these passwords could be hard-coded into the applications. So these are various ways your authentication gets compromised, and you want to pay attention to that. Again, I'm showing one real example that we found with this particular API. In this case, of course, I'm hiding this particular endpoint where we are seeing we are able to access the resource by simply just changing the URL in the way I can bypass some of the authorization that has put in place by the vendor. So you are authenticated, but you are not necessarily authorized to access other resources. So in this case, I'm authenticated, but again, I'm able to access certain resources that I'm not supposed to access. Now, let me go into a bit more detail. What are some of the best practices you can adopt to fix these issues? First of all, make sure that you have authentication for all your APIs. Doesn't matter internal, external. You want to make sure that all your APIs are authenticated. And as I will show in my zero trust model that we'll see as a reference model for API security, we'll see that how that model actually emphasizes a lot on authentication authorization problems. And once again, some of the other things you could do is rotate your API keys password continuously. Use standard authentications. When it comes to using token-based mechanisms, you want to make sure that these tokens are generated that are not easy to guess. If in any case possible, use multi-factor authentication. OAuth is a good example, but it may not be possible for you to use OAuth in all different situations, because in many cases APIs are required for machine-to-machine communication. So user intervention is not necessarily ideal in those situations, and hence you do not necessarily have multi-factor authentication. But apply these policies or best practices to the best of your ability in all the situations that you can. Now let me go into some of the authorization related problems. Authorization related problems can be categorized into object level and function level. I will give examples of both of those scenarios, but let me quickly review the Q&A. Looks like there are some questions. So one question is, what would be the recommended frequency for rotating API keys for security reasons? It really depends on how dynamic your API ecosystem is. Let's say if you have an automated process by which you can detect abuse to your APIs, then in that case, that automation can trigger the enforcement of rotating your API keys, or you can have a policy which says, okay, rotate your API keys every month. Beginning of month, every month, you may have a quarterly frequency. It really depends on the criticality of your APIs. Certain APIs, even one day compromise may cause huge business loss. So it really depends on what frequency you want to set, depending on the criticality of your business and the functionality these APIs are providing. Another question is, what is the best practice regarding frequency to change passwords? Again, similar answer. It really depends on your processes, your mechanisms. But I've seen cases where companies enforce you to change passwords every year. I've seen cases where companies force you to change your password every 60 days. So it really depends on your situation and your organization. Yeah, so that question was related to password related to API. So I got that. Thank you. Now another question is, most APIs are governed by service accounts. Some of the recommended controls would be challenging to deploy. Mitigating controls would be needed, such as monitoring of those services accounts. I am not 100% sure if you meant the actual service contracts, you mean SLAs, or you're talking about just the management of your actual API account with third parties. So both, regardless of those two situations, you need to manage both. You need to govern both, and in some cases, you may have certain restrictions in your SLAs that may require you to enforce certain constraints through the controls that you can enforce through using some technology. For example, rate limits. In many cases, your vendor may not stop your API access even if you cross the limits, but it's always good idea for you to have a control where you can see those limits, or other control mechanisms in place. So there is no right or wrong answer here. I think it really depends on your situation, but definitely you want to monitor both your actual legal agreements as well as the actual API transactions. So both are needed.
Baljeet, sorry to interrupt. We have a couple of questions on the chat that I'll read to you real quick. Some people
if they're using a web browser, they can't post in the Q&A panel.
I
So,
see. Okay.
So let me ask these couple to you, but I'll monitor the chat and I'll pose them to you. That way you don't have to try to monitor it.
Okay.
Are there standard benchmarks for APIs, and are they tested to ensure they meet recommended security standards?
Okay, so I am looking at the question. I think I believe I answered that question, but let me answer that again. Yes,
Okay.
so there are certain standards one can adopt. For example, one standard I mentioned is OWASP. So OWASP has top 10 API specific recommendations or vulnerabilities that affect those APIs. So that is one really good standard you can adopt. And we did our own independent research, which actually verifies what OWASP has identified as top problems for these APIs are actually we can see as empirical evidence in NVD data. So OWASP is one standard. You can design your own rules as well. For example, around PII, you can see, okay, do a quick analysis around does API contain any personal information? So you can have some of those part of your standard, but many of these rules will be covered by a standard like OWASP. Ted, please go ahead with the other question.
Okay, I think the other one's in the Q&A now. Are there specific logs kept for APIs and changes to those logs?
Okay, so let me see that again. Are there specific logs kept for APIs and changes to those logs? Okay, so I think the question is, are organizations keeping logs, specific logs related to APIs? If not logs, how they are keeping track of their API through various mechanisms. So logs is one way you can keep, you can track the API usage. But you may, in some cases, you may also want to record the payloads. Now, this is not necessarily specific to, are you talking about a scenario where you are consuming APIs, or you're talking about your APIs being consumed by your partners. But nonetheless, in both scenarios, you need to have some logging mechanism. In cases where your customers are using data and for privacy reasons, they do not necessarily want you to see their specific queries against your APIs, then in that case, you really want to keep when this API was called, who called it, and what are the limits, and all those logs you want to keep. So yes, logging is very important.
Okay, great. So Baljeet, why don't we do this? If you don't mind, go back to your agenda slide. I want to show everybody what's coming up for the second hour, and let's, like you said, I want to try to give everybody a short bio break for about 7 minutes and come back at maybe 5 after the hour. So can you either articulate or maybe, yeah, show on the screen? Sorry to make you jump around, but so we're here at the break, everybody, and we'll come back at 5 after 1. And then we'll get into the workshop piece of it, because we want to have time again for some Q&A at the end, but y'all been great about asking questions as we go along. So let's take a break real quick, and we will be back at 5 after the hour at 1:05.
Sounds good, Ted. A quick feedback from you. How is it going? Am I going too slow, too fast, or do you like the pace? What's your feedback?
I think it's good. I think we're on track. So, we broke right at the hour, so I think we're doing well.
Great. Thank you, Ted, for the feedback.
No, appreciate it. Okay, everybody, we'll get started back in just a few minutes. So please go ahead and take a break. While we're taking a break, I'll go ahead and fill the time just so people don't think that they've disconnected or something. Thursday, we are having another webinar, so day after tomorrow. So we packed them in at the end of the month here. A little bit was due to my schedule on that. So Thursday, we're having a ransomware panel discussion. And that'll be Thursday from 12 to 1:30. I'm participating in the panel. George Crawford, our vice president, as most of y'all know of the chapter, he's CIO and CISO of Caterpillar. And I guess, let me, so y'all aren't looking at a blank screen, I'll try to start my video. So, so George Crawford will also be on the panel. He's going to be talking about, George is going to be talking about, how you communicate to the board and the executives about ransomware, how you balance funding between enabling the business and mitigating the risk of ransomware. And especially he's going to be talking about, he's right in the middle of renewing his cyber insurance for their firm, and how the requirements have increased and where they've done that, and just kind of lessons learned around that indemnification for ransomware. And then of course we'll have Lisa Rogers on. If y'all heard my session back in June, I had her present because she actually lived through and survived a ransomware incident, which is really interesting. Everybody that's, when you can hear it from somebody that went through it, and you hear the lessons learned and stuff like that, it's very informative. So Lisa will be on as well. And it is a panel, but we'll be answering questions that are that were posed into the panel. So that's what we'll be doing. And then I will be covering something I really would encourage everyone to do, both from a cyber insurance perspective, as well as working with your software vendors, et cetera, is aligning your controls, et cetera, related to cybersecurity, especially for ransomware, to either to guidance or a framework, et cetera. So y'all may have heard me speak to that before, but the CISA division of the US government came out with their ransomware best practices. So I'll show what those best practices are and what you should be asking for from your software vendors as to how they enable those with their technologies. And then and even in the cloud, how they do it. And then from the NIST came out with their framework for ransomware. And so, how your software vendors align to that NIST framework. And speaking of that, Amazon AWS cloud service just came out with a mapping of their AWS cloud security capabilities, mapped directly over to the NIST framework. So ransomware framework. So that's very helpful as well. And I think a lot of the more significant software vendors are doing that. And this is very timely today to be talking about APIs, because just as we were talking about, yes, APIs can be utilized to spread malware and therefore, be a credible ransomware threat. And it's something that we all need to be looking at. And what's interesting about APIs that we're covering today is I see an exponential growth in APIs, especially as we move to the cloud, et cetera. And yet, I did agree with what Dr. Baljeet said in that it really, for a lot of organizations, seems to be kind of an afterthought. I'm amazed that organizations will focus so much on data loss prevention or endpoint devices and not focus near as much on these APIs, where when you look at the volume of data that's being interchanged on these APIs, it's staggering. And so it doesn't take a genius to figure out that that nefarious people are going to start taking advantage of this more and more and more. I remember back in the day, and this dates myself a little bit, but when EDI, electronic data interchange, was very popular, of course, primarily in banking, et cetera. And right about during the dot-com era, right about the year 2000, we started seeing, significant breaches and vulnerabilities exposed, et cetera, in EDI. And then they tightened that up significantly. And so, and speaking of that, I think just one thing before I turn it back over, if you've closed on a house lately, or anything like that, I just had a good friend a year ago that was selling his home. He showed up to closing. The family that was purchasing the home showed up to closing, and when they got there, they told the title company that they had wired them the night before the funds for the closing, which they were paying in full for the home. And of course, that did not go to the title company. And so, these wire transfers, especially around real estate closings, just grew exponentially. And you can imagine the money that was being lost by that. And I don't know, I had asked if there would be any FDIC insurance or anything like that that would come into play if you did that. I'm not for sure if that's the case. Unfortunately, I think those people may have lost all of their money, but I'm not positive about it. But anyway, it just does give you an idea that these are constant threats, as we all know and are aware of, et cetera. So with that, we're at 5 after the hour. I hope everybody had time for a short bio break or a coffee break. And Baljeet Malhotra, Dr. Baljeet Malhotra, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and we'll continue on with the workshop. So appreciate it, everybody.
Thank you so much, Ted, again. I'm sharing my screen. Hopefully you can see again. Okay, great. So these are a couple of slides left from the previous session. Before I jump to the actual workshop and give you some hands-on experience examples, let me wrap this up fairly quickly, and then we'll jump to the actual workshop. I tried to cover, various authentication. I couldn't fully get into the authorization related problems. I was just trying to explain, you could have object level authorization problems or function level authorization problems. Essentially, they are different from authentication in the sense that you may be authenticated, but you are not authorized to access specific resources. And oftentimes, this happens because of the way APIs are implemented or their access control mechanisms are implemented. As we investigated NVD, we found that authorization problems are one of the key problems that plague APIs. Now, this particular slide actually sums up what kind of different risks we are talking about when it comes to API management. We already spoke about there are certain security issues that can affect your APIs, authentication, authorization being one of them. But already we talked about there could be injection problems or other sensitive data related problems as well. And at the same time, you also have legal issues. Somehow they are two sides of the same coin, because if your security is compromised, your data is compromised, and your data is compromised, you're looking at some legal implications. Maybe your data is stolen, you have some lawsuits and things like that. So they are all related. But really, this actually impacts your long-term business interest as well, either in terms of finances, your operational capability to run your business, or regulatory requirements that you have. Financial in the sense that if these APIs are your revenue generating APIs, if they go down, what's impact on your finances. If these APIs are violating, if you're a consumer and you're using certain APIs that violated certain terms of services or things like that, what's the business impact on you? There are cases in which APIs can slow down your operational capabilities as well. For instance, I've seen cases where one solution was integrated, which was acquired through M&A transaction. And the long story short is there was this particular API embedded somewhere in hundreds and millions of lines of code, which was going into a loop and slowing down the entire system. So it could affect your efficiency, it could affect your product features, functions, and eventually have impact on your financials as well. If not financial, if not regulatory, not operational, you could have regulatory requirements. For example, you may not be, as part of your internal process or even enforced by your regulators, you may be required to store certain data within a certain geography. Now, if you're using a third-party API and suddenly you did not realize that, you assume that they are based in a certain country, but suddenly you realize that their data is actually, or APIs are hosted in a different country, and your data is being stored there, what is the impact? And in many cases, you may face certain hurdles in obtaining these regulatory requirements and may lead to certain other problems as an organization. So how do we address this? What are some of the guidelines or best practices or models that are out there we can adopt to actually build a good, robust program around API governance? And one of the models that I particularly found useful is a zero trust model. Now, zero trust model is not necessarily a technology that you can buy. It is a set of principles that are applied across your enterprise that will help you address some of the problems that I talked about. Now, as I mentioned in the very beginning, zero trust model is not only about API security or API risk management. It is a rather larger framework for enterprise-wide cybersecurity programs. But it's very much applicable to API security or API risk management. How? There are 7 basic principles of zero trust model. And those principles are every data or every source in your organization must be treated as a resource. APIs are nothing but your digital resource. They must be treated as a resource or as a product. And then all these resources must be communicated through secured channels. So either this is your internal API, this is your external API, all these APIs must be communicated through secure channels. Now, this goes into, where do you deploy your APIs? Are they part of your DMZ environment, or somehow you have made exceptions for certain partners where these APIs are being deployed in a different server or location? All these resources that are communicated through secured must also be accessed in a sessional fashion. What do we mean by sessional? Sessional is, do not have a fixed policy where an individual or organization always have access to your resources. Always give them sessional access. For example, for a period of an hour, or for a period of a month, or a period of a year, whatever it is. So sessional approach is something you can see with OAuth, where you have tokens that expire after a certain period. You can choose when those tokens expire, but essentially that comes down to that your accesses must be sessional. You do not have full-time access all the time at all the places. You must have a sessional approach. All these resources that are accessed in a secured way, and you are having a sessional approach, must have policies that are dynamic. Okay, what do you mean by that? So you cannot have a policy that, okay, Mr. CTO, since you are a CTO, you have access to this particular API, which is providing certain analytical capabilities for reporting or integrated with certain reports. But you really want to ensure that if this executive moves to a specific location or geography, your policy is dynamically changing according to those parameters. We see something like this with the various application access control mechanisms, but with APIs also you want to have a similar kind of policies where your policies are not fixed. Your policies are dynamic in time and space. You may have certain other dimensions, and these policies evolve as your dimensions change. The fifth core principle of zero trust model is monitoring. You must monitor your resources at all times. So in order for you to see whether these APIs are accessed in a secured way, you are monitoring the security posture of those APIs. And also the sixth principle is, you are giving access to your resources with proper authentication and authorization processes in place. As I mentioned, different frameworks already, either you are using API keys or OAuth or JWT or other kinds of technologies to authenticate your APIs, but also authorization, which are basically business logics you implement, who gets access to what resources through these APIs. And you want to enforce authorization authentication to all your APIs, regardless of these are internal, external, or whatnot. And also monitoring is something you do given that what are all the data points you already know. But the last but not the least principle is you collect as much information as possible to regularly evaluate your monitoring capability. Because this is a very dynamic ecosystem where there could be a lot of inputs to your APIs, and you can predict user behavior based on those inputs. So your policies must change, your monitoring mechanisms must change, your logs are evolving. So you collect as much data as you can to beef up your monitoring mechanisms. But of course, we are living in a GDPR world where you may have certain constraints what kind of data you can collect, either from your partners, from your customers, from your internal teams, to actually regularly monitor your APIs. But nonetheless, you collect as much as possible and enforce these policies and the rest of the principles to the best of your ability. So with that note, I will switch to the actual practical scenario. And for that, I will switch my screen and take you to a tool that I'm going to use. Ted, can you confirm you are seeing my browser instead of the slide now?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ted. So here you can see this is a tool I'm going to use, but a lot of principles I talked about, you do not necessarily need to address by using just this tool. You can use whatever tool you want, but it's just easier for me for this workshop to demonstrate some of the principles I talked about. I will go through why it is important for you to inventorize or put inventory around your APIs, why it is important for you to publish certain pieces of data that will be helpful for API governance, why it is important for you to do the security assessment, how do you govern those on an ongoing basis. So I will demonstrate all those principles I talked about through using this tool. If you do not know this tool, you can go sign in. And if you click on if you go to this link, I will put this in the chat window. So you can go to this community version, and from there you can access this. And you can hit the join button and you can access the version. If you do not have a account, you can simply create an account on the fly. It would take you maybe 1 minute or less to sign up. So I will give a quick pause so that everybody can sign in, and then we will start with the demonstration. Since I already have an account, I will simply log in. So let me know if anybody needs any help in signing up. I'll give once again, I'll give a quick pause to see everybody can sign in. And if you have any problems, just let me know.
Baljeet, can you copy the link and paste it out to the chat window real quick?
Okay, I did, but let me do it again.
Make sure you send it to everyone.
Oh, sorry. My apologies. Yeah. Everyone. Yes, you are right.
There it goes. That's it. Yeah, Nicole put it out there too. Thank you.
I did not realize that my chat was going to be.
I've done that before too. No worries.
Thank you for the pointer.
So the link is out on chat, everyone, so you can click on it and get to the web page that Baljeet is at right now.
So while you are signing up, I will start with very simple scenarios. And once again, while you're catching up with the sign-up process, it should be easy to sign up. But once you sign up, you will see a screen like this, and there you will be able to. The first thing I want you to pay attention to is, in order for you to put control, access control, or um, mechanisms where you can bring more transparency to an organization, is you want to have all your APIs published. Now, I'm not saying that these are your internal APIs, these are your external APIs. You may have different sections of your API portal where you are providing access to these different APIs depending on privileges that the different users have. All I'm saying is organize your APIs. This organization is very, very important, because if you're not organizing your APIs, quickly these APIs would run into hundreds and perhaps thousands in numbers, and it will become a nightmare. So a nice way to organize your APIs is organize them under a certain industry, or you may have a business unit, or you may have different partners. So for example, here I'm showing you different industries in which I've organized my APIs. Now, these are thousands of APIs. You may not necessarily have the same scenario in your organization, but you get the point I'm trying to make here. Once you have those APIs, you can see, okay, what those APIs are. You want to have a seamless interface to provide what these APIs do to your consumers or your users. Either your internal users or external users, does not really matter. But here you can see, for example, if I go to my, let's say, if I go to social media and technology, I'm picking up this this example because I know I can work very well with Twitter API, and everybody understand what Twitter does. So giving that demonstration is very easy for me. So here I want to see, okay, in my organization, what are different vendors from which we are consuming these social media technology related APIs. So you can see how nicely I've organized my APIs, which versions, which vendor, where exactly these APIs are hosted. So I will come to that in a minute, why this is important. But perhaps if you remember from my talk, I talked about data governance, sovereignty, and why this is important. By the way, Ted, just a quick check again. You are seeing my screen where I'm listing a bunch of APIs, correct?
I am, yeah. Starts
Good.
with the 30 boxes calendaring service.
Okay, great, great. Thank you. So another aspect of your API is you really want to have a quick search mechanism. If you have hundreds or thousands of APIs, you want to have a search mechanism which allows you to search your different APIs by different vendors, by different organizations, by different industries and whatnot. So that's what I'm showing you here. I search Twitter, it is showing me Twitter APIs, and here I can see, okay, there is a Twitter API. I can look into what this API does by clicking on that Twitter API. You can see that I'm saying that this is a Twitter API, this is the version, this is the category of the API. Now let me look into what this API does. Here I can see, as part of my providing a portal to my organization, a developer can easily see what this API does. For example, I'm providing an example response. Why this is important is, a lot of times developers end up actually spending a lot of time trying to read the documentation of the API. And if you really have worked with APIs, you'll see how cumbersome they could be. Sometimes API documentations are missing altogether. So there is no really easy way for you to seamlessly try an API before you use it. And that's the goal here. So you, as you're part of your data governance policies or management capabilities, you want to provide that seamless to your colleagues or your developers, your even this could be non-technical people who just want to see, okay, this is the product. We want to integrate Twitter. I want to quickly see what kind of data can be integrated, which will allow me to do sentiment analysis. Because these social media feeds can be used to see what people are talking about. By using these API integrations, I can do a quick assessment of my product, what people are talking about my company and whatnot. So there are a lot of different contexts under which these APIs can be useful. So not just the technical audience, but non-technical audience needs that seamless integration. So here I can see what is the example input, what is the response look like. If I invoke this API, what data would come out? So all those scenarios as you can see, I can quickly see. Also from a data governance perspective, I can see what kind of data would come through this particular API integration. Not only that, if this is somehow indicated that the health of this API is good. Now, that's another question. How do you define what is the health of this API? In this case, you can imagine the simplest definition is this API working? Okay, so before you start to invest onto this API, you can see whether this API is useful right now, whether this is functional or not. Now, not only that, but I'm also giving you the capability to actually try this API live. What do I mean by that? So if I want to actually try this API with my own input, so we are not going into detail, but you can very much imagine, APIs are nothing but as a box. You give certain inputs and they give you an output back. That's the scenario here. So I want to invoke this Twitter API to see what kind of data this would bring in. And as you can see, to help the technical or non-technical audience, they do not necessarily need to know how do I configure this API. They don't need to worry about how do I write a code snippet to actually invoke this API. What is the authentication? What is the authorization? So providing that seamless experience is very, very important as part of your data governance aspect. So here, I can skip all these parameters that is needed as input to this API because these are optional parameters. I could have a required parameters and I can simply say, okay, show me if somebody is talking about ISACA right now. So this is a live call that I'm going to invoke using this Twitter API. And if I click execute, it has actually gone and invoked that API from Twitter platform. As you know, Twitter platform, it actually this particular API provides the latest tweets that are happening on the Twitter platform. So here I can see the response has come back, and if I want to see what was my input to this API, you can see that here my input was ISACA, and I wanted to collect all the tweets happening with respect to ISACA. So let's see if there are responses that have come back. If I scroll down, I'm giving a very quick view that I can see in JSON or XML, which this is more technical for a technical audience who are actually looking into integrating this API into products or different aspects of whatever investigation they are doing. But you can see these different formats. More importantly, let's say you want to see from a data sovereignty perspective, does this API contain any personal information? So with one single click, I can do that kind of analysis. So if you remember, this was my response. Previously, I showed on that response, I did a quick PII investigation, which is a radio button here that you can click to see this is personal information, people's name, their screen names and whatnot. So what is the scenario we are talking about here? So the scenario here is you as a compliant organization, you are doing your due diligence in which you are required to do an application in which you need to consume this API, but as part of your policy, you are required not to store people's name. You want to just quickly see what tags would bring that kind of personal information. So you can do that kind of analysis very quickly. And here, as I showed, you can see from this feed, it's not very easy for me to see where exactly the personal information is embedded. But by doing that kind of PI analysis, I can quickly see under this tag, there are people's name, and basically I can drive my policy that drop screen names, drop usernames, drop entities, which will basically anonymize the tweets that I want to consume in my application, whatever that application might be. On top of that, you may have certain other requirements. Let me go through that right now. So let's say Twitter is offering this API for free. Now free does not necessarily mean that you don't have obligations. You as a compliance officer or a professional, you want to quickly see what Twitter terms of services are. So if you go visit Twitter terms of services, this is basically listed here and telling you what you should do, what you should not do. But if you're not a lawyer, especially developers who may lack that kind of background, they cannot easily figure it out, whether they are using this API in a compliant way or not. So what's the solution here? So you may want to have a tool that can quickly give you that kind of assessment onto this terms of services, which will quickly list, okay, what are the permissions of using this API? What are the obligations of this API? Just like security, legal compliance is also a collective responsibility. You cannot simply assume that your lawyer friends will take care of everything else. If you can make that informed decision upfront and work with your GRC team or legal team or whatever, and point out, okay, they are saying don't do this because that's what the system identified. Now, be mindful that systems may never be perfect, but at least they can assist you identify some of those issues. Of course, there could be false positives, there could be false negative scenarios as well. But again, machines are good, whatever they can do, and you can use them to your advantage. And furthermore, as I mentioned to you, you can also quickly see, okay, if I use this API, right now, this API I'm invoking from my community server. So it depends on where do I invoke. So, the actual API vendor, in this case, Twitter, they may read out their information from different servers they have deployed. So in this case, of course, it is being shown that this Twitter is currently hosting this particular invocation came from California. That's where they're hosted and whatnot. This is good enough. But you want to have that kind of due diligence as part of your governance process, where you want to see, okay, I'm going to use this API. I'm fine with the Twitter outputs because the data meets my requirement. I've also done PI analysis, so I know what to deprecate. I've also read the terms of services. Now I want to know, okay, what about the service? Where exactly this will be hosted? So all those steps you take are good steps you take as a best practice in order for you to make your organization more secure, more compliant. So before I move to the second scenario, let me give a quick pause to see if anybody has any question. Ted, if you don't mind reading any questions from the chat, I'm reading a Q&A in the meantime window.
Yeah, sure will. Go ahead and address the Q&A ones.
Okay, so one question is, the zero trust model appears challenging to implement for all recommendations. What is typical for most organizations and which are critical at a minimum? That's a really good question. As I mentioned, it is not possible in all situations at all time in all organizations to implement the model the way it is, right? So you have to pick and choose. For example, authentication authorization. It may not be possible for you to have a multi-factor authentication. Although Zero Trust model recommends that none of your APIs are accessible without authentication authorization. But in some cases, You may want to have an API that is fully secured, but just through API key, because simply, this API is built for machine-to-machine communication. There is no human intervention. So you pick and choose those scenarios. And let's say for the rest of the APIs that you are given to your partners, you want to have a regular way of authentication, authorization, and you want to rotate your API keys or password or whatever it is. So you decide your policies accordingly. Another question is, the IPA grouping is a manual process. Is it possible to automate and not letting someone to include an IPA that does not belong to a category? To prevent someone can hide an IPA. Sorry, just a quick clarification. Do you mean by PII or IPA? Okay, I guess you cannot speak, so maybe you can type in. So I'm not sure, what do you mean by IPA? Probably you wanted to say PII. So I'm assuming that, yes, there is a way you can put your API onto constant or continuous monitoring, and you can define what is the definition of your PII and let the system see if this API is transacting those pieces of information. And then if it detects, then it can flag and send notification, and you can work on that. So that's how you can address that concern.
Yeah, and Ernesto, I made it to where you can talk if you want. So if you want to unmute, maybe you could help clarify that, because I'm not certain either, Baljeet. So Ernesto, can you unmute and maybe clarify?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yep.
Yes, I mean, just the question was if, I mean, I understood from the presentation that the grouping is a manual process when, in this case, he had to put a specific API within a group, right? So my question was, is there a way to automate that process in order to prevent somebody to hide an API that may be included in a group that is not seen as a high risk group?
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, it is possible. I mean, these groupings, I thought you were talking about categorizations. Thank you for the clarification, Ernesto. Yeah, so absolutely. You can group your APIs depending on your own metadata. In many cases, the grouping I showed, we did it manually in the sense that this API belongs to this group and whatnot. But it is very much possible for you to automate that process as you consume, looking at certain signatures or data, and basically go from there.
Yeah, and Baljeet, one thing I'll add on the zero trust that I think you made a good point on. I agree, zero trust just in its name is daunting. But as we talked about this a little bit on the Saturday privacy session for those of y'all that were there. What we should be doing is to, if hopefully you're doing this at your organizations, but it makes life so much better if you are. You should classify the criticality of your systems. And what I mean by that is, the importance of availability for those systems. So if it's an order entry system and it needs to be 24/7, then of course that's a mission critical system. If it's an HR system that doesn't need to be up to that level of time, then that's a less critical system. So classify the criticality of your systems. And then secondly, classify your data, both on the level of sensitivity as well as the quantity, which gives you a classification for your data. If you have the data classification and you have the criticality of the systems, that combined can help you with your approach to zero trust and looking at these APIs, et cetera. I think we would all agree that mission critical or the highest critical applications, and especially ones that contain high levels of data classification, those it would absolutely be worth the effort to do the API security, et cetera for. Maybe not so much for the lower level systems, but for our most critical systems. And again, I hate to be a broken record on this, but with ransomware today, you know, yes, you don't want to be affected, but mostly you do not want to be affected on those mission critical systems. So it does justify, and I think you can build your case to management as to why you would want to do more zero trust around those mission critical systems and very sensitive data versus the lower level systems. Hopefully that helps too.
It does. It does. Thank you, Ted, for sharing your thoughts. That's very relevant. Yeah, and this is evolving. To the best of my knowledge, not organizations haven't figured this out fully yet. So they are adopting this model in various ways and capacities, and I think this will continue to evolve. But I think this all these best practices we are talking about, they are getting closer towards maturity, and we'll see perhaps new standards in the future. We'll see more best practices, how we can manage these risks. All right, so I will continue with some more scenarios. And one of the other scenarios I want to cover is the benchmarking of your APIs. Now, this question was asked multiple times. What are the standards that one can use to benchmark your APIs? So I want to show you that. So one of the standards that you can use for this kind of benchmarking is OWASP top 10. So here I want to show you a system where you can choose some of these benchmarks to, standards to benchmark your APIs. For instance, if my APIs are already in the system, it need not be this system, you could have another system, but I'm just giving you an example. I can upload my API. I can say, okay, against this API, run my broken authentication test cases or authorization test cases. As a good practice, you should not depend on a tool that gives you a rigid set of test cases. They should be configurable. So if it allows you to configure those and add your use cases, this will be nice. But again, at least you start somewhere. Similarly, not every scenario will be, or every test case will be useful in all the scenarios for all the APIs. But again, you pick and choose and run those test cases. And once you do that, of course, in this case, I can choose all, or I can choose the set of test cases I want to run. Once these test cases are run, you should be able to track the performance in terms of results, what test cases passed, what test cases failed, and how this impact your security posture. Because as I mentioned, not every test has the same importance. For example, as indicated through our research, authentication authorizations are big problems. So maybe you want to pay attention to that. If this is let's say, an API which is transacting, let's say, currency information, just exchange rate. I mean, what can you do with that? But let's say if it is a API that is transacting your customer data with the pricing information or quotation information, that could be very sensitive. So you do not necessarily want to have a very, you want to take that very lightly. But nonetheless, once you do that, you want to generate certain reports as a good practice where you can actually see what test cases passed and what test cases failed. And constantly monitoring is a key aspect of this model. As I mentioned on the last slide when I was talking about zero trust model, not just auditing one time, but also constantly monitoring this on an ongoing basis is one key principle of zero trust model. So how do you do that? Because two reasons, developers are going to hate you if you give them a tool where they have to go manually, every time they are building something, checking their application out, they have to manually run these things. What would really help them is, if this is fully automated. For example, they say, okay, for these APIs, run all these test cases every week, every month, every quarter, or whatever it is, and generate a report which looks like something like this. And not just generate report, but let's say if it failed, for example, this particular test case failed, show me where it failed, give me the report, and how do I fix it? Or if I'm not the team who build it, how do I work with the teams to build it? Actually, somebody asked this question: who's responsible for API management within an organization? That's a very tricky question. And is it the engineering team that build those APIs? Should they manage it? Or is it the business team that actually own the business unit should own the API? Or is it your InfoSec team or GRC team should own those APIs because eventually they are responsible for the security of the organization? So what's the answer? The answer is, all of them. It's a collective responsibility. And I've seen in very large organizations, resources are pulled together to provide that due diligence, to provide that governance capabilities. Let's say a team needs to use any third-party API. They reach to this team. They say, okay, we want to use this API. Do we have a vendor license already? If not, then how do we secure it? Then there is a licensing team that gets involved. Now, if there is some due diligence that needs to be done by a lawyer is a part of the, let's say, IP team, so they get involved. And of course, eventually they work together with the technical team to do the approval. Is it scalable? Maybe not. And that's where I think some of you guys asked the question. I think the grouping question was related to that. How do I group my APIs in a way that I can say, okay, all these APIs under this category are white labeled. Okay, for example, I can say my government and public services APIs are white labeled. You go ahead and use those APIs the way you want to use it, because these are free as long as you're not injecting anything to these APIs or doing something harmful. It's fine. You could have a blacklisted or list of APIs as well. We say don't use these APIs. So this organization is key to the governance. Once again, we may not have time to go through the custody and who owns these APIs and whatnot. But again, I think you get the point. But just as a quick reference, I can show you. I may have external repository, which looks like this. I may have my internal repository as well, where I am listing my own APIs that only my team can see. And that's where the ownership comes. So here you can see people's name. They configure those APIs. Maybe these are third-party APIs. Maybe these are internal APIs. I can edit them. I can provide credentials. I can change the parameters. All those mechanisms that are needed to make your APIs operational. Now, remember, these are the APIs perhaps you did not build. You are just configuring them. You are just orchestrating them in a way to bring governance to your APIs. So that's the key difference here. But in many cases, your security team may actually want to run these test cases that I talked about. So they may actually want to run these test cases, right? So even though they did not build it, but they want to run this test. Or even the engineering team who build these APIs, they want to test it because manual testing is practically impossible for them to scale. If they have 10 APIs, 20 APIs, perhaps they can do it manually. But if they have tens or even hundreds, the automation testing becomes very, very important. Now, I think I have covered the second aspect that I wanted to talk about, where the monitoring, the authorization, authentication, putting access control around it, providing policies are all really important. The last piece, which is about providing support to the leadership teams, because leadership teams within an organization may not necessarily be involved in day-to-day operational aspects of authentication, authorization, policies and all. So they want to see a bigger picture around their API ecosystem. But before I go there, let me quickly go read the Q&A section again to see if there is any question. Okay, dependent on the company, what typical departments are responsible for ensuring API policies is followed. There are various countries and businesses identified or prohibited or banned to multiple regulators, agencies in the US. Yeah, you are right. So that falls under your policies, where you may have certain policies who could access your APIs. These policies could be geography based. These policies could be organization or companies based. Yeah, so you may have a combination of both, and you can enforce these policies through, through various access control mechanisms that a tool can provide, something like this.
Hey, Baljeet, it's Ted, and I want to, if it's okay, because I know we didn't get to finish all of the workshop stuff, and I do have a hard stop, I apologize, in 10 minutes. So we will have to wrap it up right at 2 o'clock today. But I did want to launch a poll real quick, and I'm just interested from the members. Would y'all like to delve further, schedule a follow-up meeting with Baljeet and see if we can dive down a little bit further into the APIs, or do you feel like you've gotten enough today to cover it? So I would like to get your feedback on that if you don't mind, and that'll just help me as to whether to schedule it again. I'm especially asking this because we had a lot of, we've gotten a lot of questions today, which is awesome. Makes me feel good that we had Baljeet able to do this. But I know due to the questions, we may not have gotten through that. And Baljeet, while they're answering that real quick, do you, how do you want to spend these last 10 minutes? Is there something else that you feel like we need to look at from that application you were showing? Do we want to walk through the questions that we've received? How do you want to spend this last 10 minutes?
Yeah, I want to maybe spend 2 more minutes to show an executive dashboard to let the audience imagine the challenges or analytics that the executives want to see are different. And then I want to keep maybe 10, maybe not 10, but maybe 5 minutes for additional questions or thoughts.
Okay, sounds good. So about 65% of you wanted another session. So I'll take that up again. Baljeet is doing this complimentary for us, so I'll take that up with him later. But I appreciate y'all chiming in on that. So go ahead, Baljeet. I'll throw it back over to you. I'd love to see that dashboard too.
Great, thank you. So I'll do that immediately. So just give me 1 second. Somebody requested that the account they were accessing, it hits a limit. So you can see that we are eating our own dog food. But I just increased the privileges, so you should not have access getting to the system. Although this is a community system, but we like to make sure that this is not being abused. So that's why we had put the limits. But having said that, you should be able to access it now. So the last piece I wanted to show is the executive dashboard, because this is something will let the audience imagine the challenges that executive teams are facing within their organization. So that dashboard I'm talking about is this dashboard. Now, I'm not trying to claim that this is the only dashboard that is ever built or that is only possible for API governance or management. This is just a pointer or imagination that you can relate to. Executives are always interested, okay, show me all my APIs across different geographies they are deployed. Now, this could be your APIs that you're consuming, and your interest is, okay, where all our vendors are located. Because I know that we have an audit which is coming up very soon, and we do not want to have on any of our data hosted in Russia or in Europe or somewhere else. We want all our data there. So this gives you a quick ability to take that kind of decision on the fly. And here, as you can see, visually, I'm showing you, this is my entire API ecosystem. I can visually see it. Some of my API calls are going to Russia or Lithuania or whatever the case might be, or in some in Australia. And not only that, that gives me the ability, who's the vendor, or we say, okay, this is the API. This is not our API. So we are not transacting any personal information. This is in Singapore. That's fine. We are okay with that. Now, the other challenge could be you as a consumer. Okay, show me who are the biggest consumers of APIs, because if APIs moving forward are digital assets and are costing you a lot of money, you want to keep track of your expenses. So here you can quickly see, okay, which business units or which people are the most consumers of APIs within my organization. You can see the dollar values and whatnot. And once again, these are two important examples I wanted to give, but again, I don't want to claim that these are the only analytics that are possible that executives need. You may have different requirements and whatnot. And now I will switch back to my summary slide, and then I will wrap up quickly. So I'm sharing my screen one more time again, but this time my slides. So what do we learn today? What did we do today? So I tried to share this entire workflow where you can scan things. Scanning does not necessarily mean that just browsing on the API portal. Scanning could also mean deploying agents by programmatically discovering your APIs if you did not know your APIs as part of your application security. So we didn't get a chance to look into that, but we'll see if Ted, if the audience wants, I'm happy to come back and do another workshop and look into this scanning aspect in more detail. But this is the workflow we followed. And this is the summary of what we did. We basically looked into governance. We looked at how API management can be achieved within an organization. You need to build policies. You need to have access control mechanisms. You need to monitor. You need to audit. You need to give seamless experience to your developers so that they can make more informed decisions. I've said that already. Security, just like security, legal compliance, risk management is a collective responsibility. You cannot simply say that, oh, you are an audit expert or you're a lawyer and this is your problem. So the more easier we make it for the developers or the technical teams to make these informed decisions, the better our organizations will be from a security and legal posture perspective. Just a few words about us as a Teejlab. We are an API risk management company. We, as part of our ISACA relationship, we are offering complimentary risk assessment service. So if you as individual or organization, if you want to learn about that and take advantage of this complimentary service, we'll be able to do that audit for you and share a report and help you understand, how this could work in a larger organization. This is my contact information.